Welcome back to our panel discussion, Protecting Email, the Cyber Weapon of Choice, sponsored by Optiv and Proofpoint here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. Our guests today are Captain Michael Dickey, Commanding Officer of the Coast Guard Command, Control, Communications and IT Service Center, Cameron Dixon, National Cybersecurity Assessments and Technology Services Specialist at the Department of Homeland Security. Sean Lang is Chief Information Security Officer at the Library of Congress. Bhagwat Swaroop is Executive Vice President and General Manager for Email Security at Proofpoint. And Ping Look is Executive Advisor for Security and Awareness at Optiv. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. And Cameron, I'm going to throw the first question to you because just days ago, the Homeland Security Department issued that binding operational directive concerning email security and the DMARC standard. And before we get into the innards of the standard and what it will do for email systems, tell us the details of the BOD and some of the timelines and what is incumbent on agencies at this point.
Sure. So the binding operational directive, that authority stems out of FISMA 2014 that allows the Department of Homeland Security, in coordination with OMB, to issue directives to the federal civilian executive branch agencies, so non-legislative, non-judicial. They're of course, they can jump on those, but they're not required to. So the binding operational directive, there have been 6 so far. The first one some are familiar with, where my team, the National Cybersecurity Assessments and Technical Services team, performs internet-based scanning of federal agencies, and when we find critical vulnerabilities, those have to be fixed within 30 days. And that's been a great thing. 30 days is a long time. It should be shorter, and agencies do fix shorter.
I mean, 30 minutes would even be
well,
better, right?
Well, I think maybe we'll get to that point. But other directives, recently there was the Kaspersky Labs directive that required the rescission of Kaspersky-related products. This latest directive requires a couple things, both related to email and web security. For email security, it requires federal agencies within 120 days to get to set a policy setting for a DMARC of at least none. They can certainly get stronger than that, but they need to at least set a policy record.
You have to have the shrink wrap in your agency at that point.
That's right. They need to set in their DNS that they are capable of setting a policy of none, but also of receiving either aggregate, which are just like statistical-based reports, or forensic reports, or failure reports, which are pretty detailed, and that allows them to have greater visibility into their email sending infrastructure. It allows them to get their hands around that. So that's within 120 days. Other things that the directive requires, I believe, within 90 days for agencies to start TLS on their email infrastructure. And start TLS. That's start TLS. And what it does is it doesn't actually force the encryption of emails, but it makes it such that it is much harder for a passive attacker in the middle of traffic to decrypt that traffic. It makes it so that the user can initiate such that email is encrypted, at least from their endpoint to the server. So server to server is an end-to-end. It's not something like SMIME or PGP. The directive also requires federal agencies to do the HTTPS on their web sites and web services, as well as using HSTS. And strict transport security is a header that they set on their web servers, such that you cannot click through certificate warnings, as well as HTTPS is enforced. So it allows a couple of those things, as well as the rescission of some really legacy and poor crypto that even NIST has deprecated. So we still find those things, and agencies are now forced to turn those off.
So a little bit of cleanup of some of the old stuff.
It really is, and I think that this hits at the point of a lot of these directives is both the security of federal agencies themselves, but also of the users who are using these. To be straightforward, I really care very little about the agencies themselves, but I care a whole lot about the citizens who use those systems and who are maybe sometimes required to put their information inside of those systems. So it's worthwhile to ensure that we have a base level of security, that we're hitting the low-hanging fruit. We can do good, and we are doing good.
Interestingly, there's a recent Forrester research study, which they do annually, of federal websites, and more people are using them, but there's a level of distrust or worry about personally identifiable information and so on that accompanies that high usage. So this kind of gets to that whole worry. All right, Bhagwat, DMARC is now required or will be required. What is it, and what can it do for security of email?
That's a great question. So I want to demystify some of these protocols. For some they roll off the tongue, for many they don't. If you look at in a simple form, there are already some protocols in play like SPF or DKIM, which essentially are simple ways for any organization to say, my emails will come from this IP address, and it's electronically signed by me. Right? So any recipient email server can authenticate if this email is coming from that said people or not. However, DMARC takes it one step further. The main thing about DMARC, it's a superset of these SPF and DKIM, but it also gives organization feedback. So you get to know for the first time who's pretending to be you in the outside world. And I feel this is really essential to put together a 360-degree view of the visibility. People with the right email gateways will have visibility within the organization, and with DMARC, they'll have visibility the rest of the world, so they can piece together to get a 360-degree view. I am personally very excited to read about the binding operative directive that came out yesterday. As a leading email security vendor, we believe everybody should authenticate. And if you think about it, this is the last frontier which is left unauthenticated. You cannot get inside a building without a badge. You cannot enter a country without a passport. You cannot go to a website without authenticating a certificate. But you can actually send emails to anybody today without authentication. And this is where we believe most organizations who are jumping on DMARC adoption is really paving the way to restoring trust in their organization. Now, finally, I would also say, with this binding operative directive, I like the fact that the United States has joined a few countries around the world who are taking a leading position of requiring authentication in the federal agencies. By and large, it will raise the importance of authentication and also awareness in people's mind.
Interesting. So, Ping, is that something that, well, I guess agencies will be doing it. What are some strategies for getting this done?
Well, on the agency level, I couldn't tell you. But I mean, for corporations, it's going to be very difficult actually, because most corporations are only willing to do it if they have to comply. So regulations, federal regulations that state that every corporation needs to have it implemented will mean that every corporation will implement it because they have to do it in order to do business. And otherwise, adoption will be very slow. They'll do it, based on the importance that whatever CIO, CTO, CISO puts in place, saying we need to authenticate our email. For the mom and pop businesses, if they try to set up their own email server, they're gonna be like, what do I do? How do I comply? But for anyone who wants to work, on a national level, and especially with the govs, then they will implement it, right? So the easiest, fastest way to push corporations to adopt is to make it a regulation. Then they have to be compliant. And there are companies that have GRC groups that their jobs are to make sure that we are complying with our vendors and government rules.
Interesting. I guess if you're a small business, or perhaps you could use ISPs have this, and therefore you would just use them, right?
Right.
Sure.
We have seen a rise in organizations, even corporations, willingness to adopt DMARC more so in the last year than we saw ever before. And that's predominantly driven by the impact and the rise in business email compromise. BEC was not a term 5 years ago that people were familiar with. Now it's a board level conversation. So I think this issue around email authentication, organizations are looking as a risk to companies' future, companies' brand reputation, and hence we are seeing more organizations being willing. Proofpoint acquired assets of a company called ReturnPath, which was one of the original founders of DMARC.org and played a very pivotal role in DMARC's protocol being formed. But it was a slow adoption as being identified. But now there are natural forces moving in the direction, some driven by attack landscape and risk to the organization. And I think certainly policy regulations will help move it forward.
Okay, yeah, Cameron.
So most email is worthless, right? I think we all get email, and so we can say that's the case. One of the things that DMARC does is it makes it so that you can actually get rid of all the clearly worthless email, so that you can then filter out other things. But stuff that is clearly bad, that has been spoofed, that you can tell that is not legitimate, you can reject those at the mail server within the SMTP level, at the Simple Mail Transfer Protocol level. This new requirement within a year's time will require agencies to get to that point, to say of their domains that they own, they need to set a policy of reject, such that if authentication failure happens within SPF and DKIM, that it should just be rejected at SMTP and never even delivered, such that we don't have to look at it and see that it is worthless.
Yeah, sounds like we have maybe the beginnings of an answer to the trillions of emails sent every day that nobody wants, and you know, all the whole spam situation. If the spammers know, that's just a rock wall.
So it's important to understand, I think, that DMARC doesn't actually stop spoofing. So anyone can spoof.
Right.
That's the nature of the protocols that we have. But it does make the detection of spoofed email much easier.
And you go down the direction of whitelisting the senders rather than blacklisting, which is the fundamental shift.
Okay, good. And so, Captain Dickey, is that something that you're thinking about, adding to the acronyms that the Coast Guard uses? Is DMARC part of your thinking, and how do you envision getting this done?
We are absolutely interested in it and the benefit from it. But due to our location behind DoD's EEMSG gateway, the only servers that our email servers talk to are those DoD security hosts. So DoD will need to implement the DMARC standard and conduct that filtering at that level. Every email we receive, though, comes from the EEMSG gateway.
What about the implication for mobility, since the default way for mobile computing in large organizations is that you can't get away from people using their mobile devices for both personal and business? So you've got all these streams in that device that, you know, so you got to isolate them and so on. And
so what we've been able to do so far, and I think we will continue to do for the foreseeable future, is absolutely separate that you know, personal persona on a mobile device and the you know, government, you know, Coast Guard employee persona. So access for the government persona is through a security gateway into our email architecture. So there's no bleed over there, and we'll still be protected by the EEMSG and our defense in depth.
And Sean, the Library of Congress would not be subject to the binding operational directive as an agency of Congress, but fair to say that this type of technology is something you would be looking at.
Oh yes, definitely. One of the plus sides is we're allotted a little bit more flexibility in how we implement, but this is one of the important protections that, of course, we're going to roll out, and we are looking at it. One of the difficulties we're going to have is because our customer base is so diverse, it's very easy for internally the groups that deal with other federal agencies or large companies to implement something like this and not have to worry about the drawbacks. The issue is U.S. copyright deals with the American public. Anyone can copyright anything, and to have a risk of them not being able to reach back to copyright is something you have to look at, as well as the various groups that do research for the American public. Mm-hmm. You know, explaining to a small mom and pop ISP that we were blocking all of your messages because you don't have this is going to be something we're going to have to look at the best way to implement it and reduce the impact on all of our customers.
Sounds like perhaps a whole of Congress approach might be called for, but there's really no single overarching IT organization for Capitol Hill and the agencies.
Correct. We actually will all, our next meeting is next week, so we'll sit down and discuss how we're planning on implementing it in the best way to reduce the impact on all of our customers, because Capitol Hill does have some rather broad customers, be it CAPT police who have to exchange information with law enforcement.
Okay, and Bhagwat, you said something we kind of went by fast, a fundamental shift versus blacklisting versus whitelisting. Just explain that one more time, because I think that gives a lot of insight into what this protocol
Sure, happy
accomplishes.
to. So I think the fundamental approach is today anybody sends email to you, Tom, and your email server will allow that. That allows a perpetrator or a legitimate sender to send emails to you. The whole point of authentication with DMARC is that I will only let senders who pass authentication's email to go forward. So if I send an email from my email address at proofpoint.com, the email will reach you only after your email gateway authenticates, yes, this email did come from Bhagwat, yes, had the right credentials from proofpoint.com. So in a way, you're cutting through the noise and only allowing the legitimate email to flow through. However, this is where things get interesting. Today, to move from a very black and white world to only, whitelisting, there is a lot of gray in between. And this is where having a sophisticated tool so you can parse it out in a more automated way really plays a big role.
All right, so a lot to think about, a lot to do. I want to thank today's guests because we are out of time. They are Ping Look, Executive Advisor for Security and Awareness at Optiv. Bhagwat Swaroop is Executive Vice President and General Manager for Email Security at Proofpoint. Sean Lang, Chief Information Security Officer at the Library of Congress. Cameron Dixon, National Cybersecurity Assessment and Technology Services Specialist at the Homeland Security Department. And Captain Michael Dickey. He's Commanding Officer of the Coast Guard Command, Control, Communications, and IT Service Center. I'm Tom Temin, Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsradio.com. Use the search term Optiv Proofpoint.